I used to think I had a perfect life, a beautiful wife, a bright young son, and a stable job that kept us comfortable. Hannah and I had been together for over a decade, and we'd built a home and a life I believed would last forever. Our son, Jake, was our world. 10 years old, always curious and full of questions, he was the center of our little universe. But in recent months, I started to notice things were changing with Hannah. At first, they were little things, barely noticeable. She used to greet me at the door with a smile after work, ask me about my day, even joke with me about the clients who annoyed me. We'd laugh, vent, and share those moments that made us feel connected, even after all these years. But that warmth began to fade. She seemed distracted, always on her phone or off doing something, her laughter sounding hollow, her responses curt. One evening, I asked her if everything was all right. She looked up from her phone, startled as if she hadn't even realized I was there. Her answer was clipped. "I'm fine, Evan. Just busy with school events for Jake." I wanted to believe her. She'd always been involved in Jake's school activities, volunteering for events and helping the teachers. But lately, she was gone more often than usual, attending meetings and doing extra work that she'd never mentioned before. Hannah started talking about one teacher in particular, Mr. Gregg. Every few days, she'd bring him up casually, sometimes with a laugh or a quick story about something he'd said or done. But something about her tone felt different. She described him as dedicated, inspiring, and really talented with the kids. That level of admiration caught my attention. At first, I brushed off the feeling it seemed irrational. This was my wife, the mother of my child. But as the weeks went on, her mentions of him grew more frequent. She'd smile in a way that felt unfamiliar when she spoke about him, and her eyes seemed to light up. It was a look I hadn't seen in a while, one that used to be reserved for me. Then, there were the late evenings. Hannah started staying at the school longer than ever before. When I'd ask her why she was out so late, she'd respond with frustration. "Evan, I already told you. Mr. Gregg needs extra hands for these events. He's really working hard for the kids." The excuses sounded reasonable, and yet, something didn't sit right with me. Our conversations started to turn into arguments. One Friday evening, I got home from work to find a note on the counter. "When is school to help set up for the fundraiser tomorrow? Don't wait up." No explanation, no time estimate. She'd never left a note like that before. That night, I sat alone in our living room, replaying moments from the past few weeks in my mind. I wondered if I was overthinking things, but the doubts were too loud to ignore now. The following weekend, I decided to clear my head. Jake was playing outside, and I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes, lost in thought. Just as I was finishing up, Hannah's phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, a quick glance, really, and saw a message from a contact named Greg. It simply read, "Thanks for all your help yesterday. Couldn't have done it without you." I tried to ignore the creeping unease. After all, this was her son's teacher. Of course, they'd be in touch. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling gnawing at me, that sense that something wasn't quite right. The next few days only added to the suspicion. Hannah started making excuses to leave the house more frequently, claiming she needed supplies or had meetings related to school events. One night, after she left, I took a closer look around our house. Everything seemed the same, yet I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. Our home, which had once felt so warm and filled with love, now felt like a shell hiding secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. I decided to check her social media accounts. Not out of mistrust, at least, that's what I told myself, but just to see if she'd posted anything about these school events. Maybe there'd be photos or updates from the fundraiser she'd been talking about so often. But her social media was quiet. Nothing about the events, no photos of her and the other volunteers, nothing. One night, after another late meeting at the school, I confronted her. I asked why she was spending so much time there and mentioned that Mr. Gregg seemed to be taking up a lot of her attention. She got defensive, saying I was being paranoid. She insisted it was all for Jake, that I should understand her dedication as a mother. I wanted to believe her, but the doubt was growing into something that felt impossible to ignore. My mind kept returning to that message from Greg. I wondered if I was reading too much into things, letting my imagination run wild. But then, I realized something unsettling. She had stopped looking at me the way she once did. The warm glances, the small gestures of affection, they were all slipping away. And in their place was a distance I couldn't bridge, no matter how hard I tried. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that my marriage was slipping through my fingers, and I was powerless to stop it. But if she was hiding something, I was determined to find out. A few days after my confrontation with Hannah, I was still wrestling with a mix of guilt and suspicion. I felt torn on one hand. I didn't want to believe that anything was truly wrong, but on the other, her behavior had become impossible to ignore. I decided that I needed to see for myself what was really going on. One Tuesday afternoon, I left work early without telling her and drove over to Jake's school. The lot was nearly empty, which made my arrival stand out more than I'd hoped. I sat in my car, heart pounding, watching the entrance to the building. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as paranoid or, worse, to create a scene. But I needed answers. I could feel a shift happening in my marriage, and the only way to understand it was to see it with my own eyes. After a while, I saw Hannah's car pull into the lot. I took a deep breath as she got out, wearing the same neatly pressed dress she'd left the house in that morning. She moved with purpose, a slight smile on her face as she walked briskly toward the school entrance. That smile, the one she used to have when she'd see me after a long day. It wasn't a smile meant for a school volunteer event. She disappeared into the building, and I waited, unsure of my next step. I considered leaving and convincing myself that this was all in my head, but something inside me refused to let go. I waited until I saw the janitor unlock a side door, then I slipped in quietly, trying to blend into the background. The hallways were mostly empty, so it wasn't hard to avoid drawing attention. The school was quiet, save for the muffled voices coming from a classroom down the hall. I moved closer to the source of the voices, stopping just outside the classroom door. I could hear Hannah's voice and the low rumble of a man's reply, "Mr. Gregg," I assumed. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying a warmth and ease that felt out of place in an empty school after hours. I leaned in, straining to make out the words. "Thank you for all the extra help, Hannah," Mr. Gregg's voice said, his tone soft. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Anything for you," Hannah replied, a lightness in her voice that I hadn't heard in months. My stomach clenched. Their voices were too close, too familiar. I forced myself to stay put, waiting for something that would confirm what I feared. After a few minutes, there was a lull in the conversation, followed by a soft laugh, Hannah's laugh, the one she used to reserve for our private moments. It was a sound that used to feel like home, but here, in this hallway, it felt like a betrayal. I stepped back, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't bear to see anything more, so I slipped out the way I'd come, my thoughts a chaotic mess. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, staring blankly ahead. I tried to convince myself that what I'd heard wasn't enough, that I was jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I knew there was something between them. And the idea that Hannah might be sharing a connection with another man, a connection she'd once had with me, was devastating. That night, Hannah came home late, just as she'd said she would. I pretended to be asleep, not trusting myself to look her in the eye. She slipped into bed without a word, as if nothing had happened, while I lay there, paralyzed by anger and betrayal. In that moment, I knew I had to find out more. I needed real proof, not just my suspicions and what I'd overheard. The next day, I decided to start keeping track of her schedule, noting the times she'd leave and come back, cross-referencing them with her excuses. I also started paying more attention to her phone, hoping to catch a glimpse of any messages from Mr. Gregg. But she was cautious, barely letting her phone out of her sight. When I did manage to glance at it, it was always clean. No incriminating messages, nothing suspicious. One evening, while she was in the shower, I picked up her phone and noticed an app one hadn't seen before, a messaging app she'd never used around me. My hands shook as I opened it, heart pounding in my chest. But it was locked with a code, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't guess it. Frustrated, I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, knowing I'd have to try another approach. Over the next week, I decided to install a small tracking app on her phone. It wasn't a choice I took lightly, but I needed to know if my suspicions were true. I'd never pictured myself doing something like this, yet here I was, reduced to spying on the woman I'd loved and trusted for years. The tracking app allowed me to see her location, and I quickly noticed that on the nights she stayed late for schoolwork, she wasn't at the school at all. She'd go to a small restaurant on the outskirts of town, spend an hour or so there, then head back home, always careful to arrive late enough to keep up the charade. Finally, on a night she claimed to be at a volunteer meeting, I decided to go to the restaurant myself. I parked far enough away to avoid being seen and waited. I saw her car parked near the entrance, confirming she was inside. A few minutes later, Mr. Gregg walked in. My heart sank as they met at a booth by the window. I watched, feeling the betrayal unfold before my eyes. They leaned in close, talking, smiling, laughing, oblivious to the world around them. It was at that moment I realized that the bond we'd once shared was now shattered. This wasn't just about some late meetings or an innocent friendship, it was a full-blown affair. And it had been happening right under my nose. As I sat there in the darkness, watching my wife share the kind of intimate moments with another man that used to belong to me, I felt something inside me break. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd found my proof, and with it, the final confirmation that my marriage was slipping beyond repair. I couldn't shake the image of them together, sitting in that booth, sharing quiet laughs and stolen glances. They were comfortable, close in a way that people can only be when they've shared something real. It was all the confirmation I needed, but I felt compelled to know exactly how deep this betrayal ran. The next few days were a blur. Every time I looked at Hannah, I saw her sitting across from him, leaning in with that smile, the one that used to be reserved for me. She had no idea that I'd caught on, and that ignorance only fueled my need for answers. So, I dug deeper. One evening, after she'd fallen asleep, I managed to retrieve her phone, and this time I was ready. I'd spent hours watching tutorials on how to bypass the lock screen, and after a tense few minutes, the phone unlocked. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages, dreading what I might find yet unable to stop myself. My hands shook when I saw his name, Greg, sitting at the top of her contacts, marked by a small heart emoji beside it. The messages left little to the imagination. They spoke in code, as if they were trying to keep things hidden, but their intentions were clear. Messages like, "Can't wait to see you again," and "Last night was amazing. I haven't felt that way in years." Her responses were just as eager, mirroring the feelings she'd once shared with me. I felt like an intruder, looking at someone I no longer recognized. This woman, my wife, had become a stranger. But one message caught my attention, one that made my stomach churn. "I'll be there tonight, same place as usual." It was sent that afternoon, meaning their next meeting was only hours away. My blood ran cold as I realized that tonight, I could finally see the full extent of their betrayal with my own eyes. When she told me she'd be working late, I played along, pretending to believe her. She kissed me on the cheek before she left, just like she always did, but this time, her touch felt foreign, hollow. As soon as she was out the door, I followed, making sure to keep a safe distance so she wouldn't see me. She drove to the same restaurant on the edge of town, and as she parked, I watched her adjust her hair and check her reflection in the rearview mirror. She was making herself look perfect for him. I waited a few minutes before heading inside, not wanting her to see me. I slipped into a booth near the back, keeping myself hidden, but with a clear view of their table. My heart pounded as I watched them greet each other. They embraced, holding each other a little too long for it to be innocent. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, and I knew then that whatever they had wasn't just a fling. It was real, at least to her. They talked, laughed, shared intimate looks that made my stomach turn. Watching them, I felt a mix of rage, humiliation, and profound sadness. Every gesture, every touch, they all felt like a slap in the face, each one driving home just how far she drifted from me. I thought about all the times she told me she was just helping out for Jake's sake, all the nights I'd sat alone, convincing myself that her distance was temporary. The real blow came when he reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "I can't believe we've come this far. Do you ever think about leaving him?" My chest tightened, and I leaned in, straining to hear her response. She hesitated, glancing down at their hands entwined on the table. Sometimes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how much longer I can keep up this double life, Greg. I want to be with you, but it's complicated. Her words echoed in my head. Double life. That's what my marriage had become. A lie, an illusion that she'd chosen to maintain only for convenience. They spent the rest of the evening talking in hushed voices, oblivious to the devastation they were causing just a few tables away. When they finally stood to leave, I slipped out of the restaurant ahead of them, unable to bear another second of their charade. I drove home in a fog, every word she'd said playing over and over in my mind. She considered leaving me. She was torn between our life together and this fantasy she built with him. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I decided that I wouldn't confront her, not yet. I wanted her to know that I knew, but I didn't want her to see the hurt, the anger that was boiling inside me. She deserved to feel the weight of what she'd done, just as I had. But I also knew that simply walking away wouldn't be enough. I wanted her to feel the betrayal, the heartache, the humiliation that I had felt. If she was going to play this double life, I'd make sure it came at a cost. The first step in my plan was simple. I would reconnect with Lauren, an old friend who had recently come back into my life. She was everything Hannah no longer was: warm, attentive, and genuinely interested in me. I knew that if I played this right, Hannah would see just how easily she could be replaced. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of betrayal finally lifted, replaced by a sense of grim determination. I would make her understand the depth of what she had done. She'd broken my heart, shattered my trust, and torn our family apart. And now, she would know what it felt like to lose something she had taken for granted. I had found my proof, and with it, the resolve to make her face the consequences of her choices. The night I found out about her affair felt like a turning point. As the hours crept by, my anger settled into something colder, something more calculated. I knew I couldn't just confront Hannah and let her off with an argument or even a divorce. No, that would be too easy. She'd betrayed me in a way I hadn't thought possible, and I wanted her to understand the depth of what she'd done. I started with Lauren. We'd reconnected a few months back, just by chance, at a coffee shop downtown. She'd been an old friend from college, someone I'd lost touch with over the years, but who had always held a place in my life. We'd caught up, exchanged numbers, and even met up for coffee a couple of times since then. I'd never thought of her as anything more than a friend until now. Lauren had always been the opposite of Hannah. She was straightforward, warm, and genuinely kind. She'd gone through her own rough patch with a broken engagement, so she understood the pain of betrayal. I knew that reconnecting with her would be the perfect way to plant the seeds of my own revenge, and, if I was being honest, it felt good to have someone who cared about me. I reached out to her more often, intentionally letting our conversations become longer, more frequent, more personal. At first, Lauren was surprised by how often I was reaching out, but she didn't question it. She welcomed me with open arms, and before long, we were meeting up for drinks, sharing stories and laughs, and slipping back into the easy rhythm we'd had all those years ago. I kept things subtle, never explicitly saying anything about Hannah's betrayal, but she could tell something was wrong. She didn't press me, though. She just listened. And with each day, I could feel the tension between us growing. Meanwhile, I made sure Hannah would notice. I started staying out later, casually mentioning my meetings with Lauren, and not bothering to hide my phone when it buzzed with a text from her. I knew that Hannah would start putting the pieces together. I wanted her to feel a sliver of the doubt and suspicion she'd planted in me. One evening, Hannah finally confronted me. She asked why I'd been spending so much time with Lauren, her tone carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her eyes. It was almost satisfying to watch her squirm, to see her uncertainty. Lauren's been going through some stuff, I replied smoothly. She's an old friend. She needs someone to talk to. I could see her jaw tighten, but she said nothing, just nodded and walked away, leaving the question hanging between us. For once, she was the one unsure, the one feeling something slipping out of her control. Over the next few weeks, I leaned into my plan. I let Hannah catch glimpses of my phone screen when Lauren texted, and I made sure to leave the house looking a little too put together whenever we met up. I even stayed out late a few nights, only to come home and find Hannah sitting up, pretending to read, her eyes flicking up to me as if she were waiting for an explanation. Then, One Saturday night, I took it a step further. I invited Lauren to a charity event downtown. It was something Hannah and I used to go to together every year, but I knew she'd be busy at school. I dressed up, left the house early, and didn't even try to hide where I was going. As I walked out the door, I noticed Hannah watching from the window, her face a mixture of confusion and worry. I could feel her eyes on me as I drove away. Lauren looked stunning that night. I couldn't deny that. And as the night went on, I let myself relax, enjoying her company in a way that felt genuine, unburdened by the lies that had surrounded me at home. When I took her hand to help her up the steps to the venue, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. It was real. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. We spent the evening laughing, talking, just enjoying each other's company. It felt good to be with someone who genuinely cared about me, who hadn't betrayed my trust. And as we left, she hugged me, holding on just a bit longer than usual. In that moment, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't just using Lauren as a tool for revenge. I was beginning to care for her. When I got home that night, Hannah was waiting for me. She'd found a text from Lauren that had come in while I was driving back. She stood there, her face pale, phone clutched in her hand. "So, this is what you've been doing," she accused, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that supposed to mean something to you?" I replied, keeping my tone even. I watched her, waiting for her to say something, to try to defend herself, maybe to deflect. But she just looked at me, her expression shifting from anger to desperation. She knew. "You know, don't you?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. I met her gaze, letting the silence settle before I nodded. "Yes, Hannah, I know everything. And I think it's time you felt what it's like to be betrayed." She looked stunned, at a loss for words. For the first time, she was the one caught off guard, the one grasping for something to say. She tried to apologize, stumbling over words, but it was clear the reality of her choices had finally hit her. I could see the guilt and shame washing over her, but it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't the same person who had loved her so deeply. That version of me was gone, replaced by someone who now wanted to see her suffer. The tables had turned, and now she was the one feeling the weight of betrayal. As I watched her break down, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing she'd finally understand the pain she had put me through. I wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain. I was ready to move forward, with or without her. And the life we'd built together? That was already crumbling beyond repair. The confrontation left a chill in the house. For days afterward, Hannah barely spoke to me, her once familiar presence now an unsettling reminder of everything we'd lost. I was certain that she was haunted by the knowledge that I knew about her affair, but that was only half of what weighed on her. She knew I wasn't just hurt. I was actively showing her how it felt to be betrayed, and that was a pain she hadn't expected. After our confrontation, I didn't hold back with Lauren. We began spending even more time together, our connection growing in ways that felt both right and dangerous. I could see Hannah watching me each time I left, a flicker of fear in her eyes, realizing I'd found comfort elsewhere, comfort she'd deliberately thrown away. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room scrolling through my phone, Hannah approached me. Her face was strained, as if she'd been rehearsing what to say. "Evan, I need to talk to you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up, waiting, unwilling to make this easy for her. "Go on," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. She took a shaky breath, wringing her hands. "I know I hurt you. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I don't expect forgiveness. But seeing you with Lauren, knowing what I did, it's breaking me. I never thought I'd have to watch you move on with someone else." Her words hung in the air, loaded with guilt and the hint of jealousy. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but I couldn't let myself feel sympathy. The image of her with Greg was still too fresh, too raw. "You didn't think of that when you were with Greg, did you?" I asked, letting the bitterness seep into my voice. She flinched, and I saw her lower lip tremble. "No, I wasn't thinking at all," she admitted, voice barely audible. "I thought you didn't care anymore. I thought our marriage had just faded. But seeing you with Lauren made me realize that maybe I was the one who gave up too soon." I almost laughed at her admission, at the irony of her realizing her mistake only when faced with the consequences. "You're only saying this because you're afraid of losing me," I replied coldly. "You had your chance to be faithful, Hannah, but you threw that away." The look of despair on her face deepened, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of remorse. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the image of her betrayal, the weeks of deceit she'd woven without a second thought. I couldn't just let that go. I wouldn't. As she opened her mouth to say something, a notification pinged on my phone. It was a message from Lauren, and I made no effort to hide it. Hannah's eyes fell on the screen, and I saw the hurt flash in her gaze. She knew exactly what was happening. Lauren had become my way of showing her that she wasn't the only one who could replace love with something new. Without a word, I stood up and headed toward the door, leaving her in the living room. She didn't follow, and I could feel her silent despair trailing behind me. I met up with Lauren at a small cafe downtown, and as we sat together, I realized I'd found something I hadn't expected, a connection that went beyond revenge. Lauren wasn't just a way to make Hannah jealous. She was someone who saw me, who actually cared. That night, when I got home, I found Hannah in the kitchen, sitting with her head in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes rimmed red from tears. "Evan, please, can't we talk about this? I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but can we at least try to fix things? For Jake's sake." The mention of our son twisted something inside me. I knew Jake was caught in the crossfire, an innocent bystander to the wreckage we'd created. But as much as I wanted to be there for him, the thought of staying in a marriage poisoned by betrayal felt unbearable. "Jake deserves a stable home, not one where his parents are just pretending," I replied, my voice hard. "I can't look at you the same way, Hannah. Every time I try, I see you with him, and I can't erase that." Her face crumpled, and she sobbed openly, pleading with me to reconsider. But I was done. I was finished pretending that we could patch over what had happened. Betrayal had its consequences, and now she was living them. I slept in the guest room that night, and every night after. Hannah and I barely exchanged words. She grew more distant, likely meeting up with Greg, or at least hoping he'd offer her the comfort she'd once found in me. I didn't care anymore. I had my own plans, my own future to think about. With Lauren, I felt something real, something that didn't carry the weight of secrets and lies. A week later, I came home to find Hannah in a rage. She'd found messages from Lauren on my phone, ones I hadn't bothered to hide. "So this is it?" she yelled. "You're just going to flaunt it in my face, make a fool of me in front of everyone?" I looked at her, unflinching. "You have no right to feel betrayed. You chose this the moment you started seeing Greg. And now you know what it feels like to be discarded, to watch the person you love find comfort elsewhere." The room fell silent, her anger deflating as quickly as it had come. She looked defeated, as if the reality of her actions had finally sunk in. She whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Neither did I," I replied, my voice cold. "But here we are." In the days that followed, we filed for divorce. It was inevitable, a slow unraveling of the life we'd once shared. Jake, caught in the middle, struggled to understand why his parents were tearing apart the world he knew. We made arrangements, tried to keep things civil for his sake, but the damage was done. Hannah lost her place in my heart, and I realized I'd lost the life I'd once cherished. But in its place, I found something new, something that didn't hold the weight of betrayal. I had a future, even if it wasn't with her. The divorce process moved faster than I'd expected. Papers were signed, and the life Hannah and I had built together was being legally divided. But while I'd mentally prepared myself to cut all ties, there was still a lingering tension, an unspoken confrontation between us that neither of us had dared to address fully. One evening, after I'd put Jake to bed, I found Hannah waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked worn, a shadow of the person she used to be, and I felt an odd mix of resentment and pity. She asked if we could sit down and talk. I nodded, preparing myself for yet another round of her apologies. But this time it was different. She looked straight into my eyes, as if she were finally ready to say something she'd been holding back. "Evan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know there's no going back, and I know I messed everything up. I'm not here to ask for another chance. But I want you to understand, It wasn't just about Greg. It wasn't just about you either. I waited, unsure of what to say, my mind already reeling at what was coming next. I felt invisible. Evan, she continued, her voice wavering. Somewhere along the way, we lost each other. You were always so focused on work and Jake and, I don't know, I just didn't feel like I mattered anymore. It was a low blow, but her words struck a nerve. Maybe she was right. Maybe, in the years we'd spent trying to keep up with life's demands, I'd stopped seeing her the way she needed. But her words didn't change the fact that she had betrayed me, that she'd chosen Greg over our marriage. And while I could understand her loneliness, I couldn't forgive her actions. I get that you felt lost, Hannah, I replied, my tone harsh, but you chose to deal with it in the worst way possible. I was here. You could have come to me, told me how you felt. But instead, you turned to someone else and lied to me, to Jake. You destroyed our family because of some cheap thrill. Her face crumpled, and I saw tears fill her eyes. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was wrong, and I regret it every single day. But knowing you've moved on with Lauren, it's a punishment I'll have to live with. The mention of Lauren brought a flicker of satisfaction, but also guilt. Lauren had become more than just a tool for revenge. She was someone who understood me, who had been there when my world fell apart. But the truth was, I wasn't just with her to hurt Hannah. I was with her because, for the first time in a long time, I felt alive again. Hannah looked down, her shoulders slumped, as if she'd finally accepted the reality of what she'd done. Jake's been asking questions, she said softly. He wants to know why we don't spend time together as a family anymore. Why you're with Lauren. He thinks you don't want to be his dad anymore. That hit me hard. Jake had been caught in the middle of all of this, and despite my anger toward Hannah, I tried to shield him from the mess our marriage had become. But it was clear that he felt the strain, and I couldn't bear the thought of him thinking I'd abandoned him. I would never leave Jake, I replied firmly. He's the one good thing that came out of all of this. Hannah nodded, wiping her eyes. He needs you, Evan, more than ever. And as much as I hate this situation, I'll support you and Lauren if it means he'll be okay. For the first time, I saw real remorse in her eyes, not just for what she'd done to me, but for how her actions had affected Jake. I could feel the anger simmering down, replaced by a strange sense of closure. Hannah was finally acknowledging the damage she'd caused, and while it didn't make everything right, it was a start. But as we sat there, staring at each other across the table, I realized that this was truly the end. No matter how much we talked, no matter how many apologies were exchanged, we'd both changed too much to go back to what we were. A few nights later, it all came to a head. Jake had a school event, and as we stood there together, watching him on stage, I caught sight of Greg in the crowd. He hadn't expected me to be there, and the moment our eyes met, his expression turned to one of discomfort. I felt an intense anger flare up inside me, a final surge of resentment for the man who had torn my life apart. After the event, he approached us, trying to make polite conversation, as if he and I hadn't become bitter enemies. I stared him down, refusing to extend a hand. You've done enough damage, Greg, I said quietly. I'd appreciate it if you kept your distance from all of us. He nodded, flustered, and walked away without another word. Hannah stood beside me, looking relieved, as if some weight had been lifted. Thank you, she whispered. Watching him go, I nodded, feeling an unexpected release of my own. That night, as I drove Jake home, I felt a strange sense of peace. My marriage was over, my family was broken, but for the first time, I felt like I could finally move forward. I'd come face to face with the man who'd stolen my life, and I'd told him to stay away. The past was the past, and now I could finally leave it behind. As Jake drifted off to sleep in the back seat, I realized that this, my son's happiness and well-being, was all that mattered. And with that knowledge, I found the strength to let go of the resentment, the pain, and the betrayal. It was time to start over, not as a man defined by revenge or anger, but as a father ready to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Life moved on, and with the divorce finalized, things finally started to settle. The house felt emptier, quieter, but there was also a sense of relief in that quiet. My relationship with Lauren continued to grow, slowly and steadily, and she became a true source of support as I tried to rebuild my life. I knew she wasn't just a replacement for what I'd lost. She was something new, something I could build with a fresh foundation of honesty and understanding. But as the days turned to weeks, I noticed changes in Jake. He seemed withdrawn, quieter than usual. The laughter that once filled our home was replaced by silence, and his questions about why things had to change grew more frequent. He was still adjusting to the split, trying to understand why his parents couldn't be together. Despite my best efforts, I could see that he felt caught between two worlds. One evening, after dropping Jake off at Hannah's, I found myself sitting alone in the car, wondering if there was anything more I could do. Co-parenting had its challenges, and I was doing my best to support Jake, but it was clear he needed more than just his parents. He needed stability, guidance, and, above all, reassurance that he was loved, no matter what. A few days later, Hannah called me out of the blue, her voice hesitant. "Evan," she began, "Jake's been having a hard time adjusting. He's been spending a lot of time with Mr. Gregg after school." Hearing his name made my jaw clench, but I kept my tone even. "Why is that?" I asked, trying not to let the bitterness creep into my voice. She hesitated. "He's become a sort of mentor to Jake. He's been helping him cope with everything that's happened." I think it's actually helping him, Evan." The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had torn my marriage apart was now a source of comfort for my son. At first, I was furious. The idea of Gregg becoming a fixture in Jake's life felt like an insult, a twist of the knife that I wasn't sure I could accept. But as I mulled it over, I realized that my anger toward Gregg didn't matter here. What mattered was Jake and his well-being. Later that week, I sat down with Jake. I could see the confusion in his eyes, a reflection of the storm that our family had become. "Buddy, I know this has been a lot," I told him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "I just want you to know that whatever happens, I'm always here for you." He nodded, but his eyes drifted down, and he hesitated before speaking. "Dad, Mr. Gregg says it's okay to feel sad. He says even grown-ups make mistakes sometimes." Hearing this was like swallowing broken glass, but I stayed calm, forcing a gentle smile. "Mr. Gregg is right. We all make mistakes. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Your mom and I, we just couldn't be together anymore. But that doesn't change how much we both love you." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with questions I didn't have easy answers to. "Dad, do you hate him? Mr. Gregg, I mean?" The question caught me off guard. I took a deep breath, grappling with my emotions. I knew that if I expressed my resentment, it would only add to Jake's confusion. "No, buddy, I don't hate him," I finally said. "Sometimes, people do things that hurt others, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. What matters is that he's helping you. And if he's someone you trust, then that's okay with me." Jake gave a small nod, a faint glimmer of relief crossing his face. I could see that this acceptance, as hard as it was for me, was what he needed. Gregg was playing a role in Jake's life that I couldn't fill right now, a role that provided stability during a time of upheaval. As difficult as it was, I had to let go of my pride for the sake of my son's happiness. In the following weeks, I learned to make peace with Gregg's presence. We were never friends. In fact, I kept my distance whenever I saw him at school events or during pickup and drop-off. But seeing how Jake's mood improved, how he slowly returned to his cheerful self, I understood that Gregg's presence was doing something I couldn't. And in some strange way, I was grateful. Lauren noticed the shift in me, too. One evening, as we sat together, she took my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Evan. Jake needs everyone he can trust right now, and if Gregg's helping him, then it's a good thing." Her reassurance meant more than she knew. I'd spent so long holding on to the bitterness, to the betrayal, that learning to let it go was both a relief and a struggle. But with Lauren's support, I was beginning to accept that this was my new reality, and my responsibility was to give Jake the best life I could, regardless of the past. Months passed, and slowly, a new normal settled in. Jake adapted, finding comfort in the routine of split households and his new support system. As for me, I finally found peace, realizing that letting go of my anger didn't mean I was letting go of my dignity. It simply meant that I was choosing to put my son first. Hannah and I remained civil, and while we never discussed Greg, I knew she was doing her best for Jake, too. Our lives had taken different paths, but we shared one unbreakable bond: the love we had for our son. And as much as our marriage had ended in betrayal, it had also given me Jake, the one person who made everything worth it. In the end, I'd come to terms with the roles we all played, each of us contributing something to Jake's life. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was moving forward, and with Lauren by my side and Jake thriving, I realized that maybe, just maybe, everything had turned out the way it was meant to.